Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now to offer more insights into UN peacekeeping missions in Africa, as well as the risks involved, I have expert guests with me in studio. Mr. Mwenda Mbijue, the security analyst and CEO of Eye on Security, as well as Dr. Mustafa Ali, a security and conflict transformation expert. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining in this conversation. Now, the central fact that has basically put this topic on the table is the fact that the UN peacekeeping missions have seen more deaths in the past 5 years than in any other 5-year period of their history. The majority of those deaths taking place in Africa. Dr. Ali, I'll start with you. Why is Africa the most dangerous place on the continent for UN peacekeepers, in the world really, for UN peacekeepers?
Yeah, one of the, thank you. One of the issues really that is making these missions very dangerous and the increasing number of deaths on the UN peacekeepers is that we have increasingly non-state actors involved in these conflicts. And non-state actors do not subscribe to any of the international laws in the asymmetric sense of the conflicts that we have involving violent extremism and terrorism. The rebels are fighting on their own. In the past and in other conflicts, you have state actors that are the belligerents. They are the ones who are fighting, and therefore they subscribe to the tenets of the United Nations. Groups like Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, or the Allied Democratic Force operating in Uganda or Congo do not subscribe to any of the UN tenets. In fact, do not recognize the UN peacekeepers.
And then this brings us to, of course, this really important question of if the nature of conflict has changed in various parts of the world, especially here in Africa, that then suggests that the UN itself and the way that it manages peacekeeping operations needs to fundamentally change too. What's your view?
I agree with you unreservedly, because the UN for a long time has hung on the, and I'll use the word false belief that when they go to a conflict zone, that zone is so desperate for peace that their presence means everything is fine, all guns are silent, let's have peace. But conflict has since evolved. These groups, as my co-panelist said earlier, they are also evolving in their weapons, in the approach to the conflict itself. They are either terrorists or extremists of some kind, rebel groups and movements. They don't want peace. In Africa, most of those rebels want the resources in Africa. They want the gold, they want the diamonds. When the UN comes, it's a necessary disruption to them. Now the UN comes speaking peace, and these people come speaking, we don't want peace. And the UN has not been able to read the changing terrain for a long time. So the UN ends up being trapped in a situation where they are singing peace and these guys are singing war, and the UN is not able to conform to educate them on what it means to have peace.
This does bring us now to the cruise report that many people are talking about, a report looking into the rise in casualties of UN peacekeepers and making some key recommendations, one of them being the use of force. Now, many have been surprised by the blunt language used in this particular report, and I'll just quote directly from it, and it reminds me of just what you've said now, that hostile forces do not understand a language other than force. The United Nations needs to be strong and not to fear to use force. Missions should go where the threat is in order to neutralize it. Just coming back to what you said earlier, isn't this quite a departure from the emphasis on political solutions and dialogue that we're used to when it comes to the UN?
Take the UN peacekeeping force to an ISIS zone in Syria, for example, and deploy those soldiers to come into contact with ISIS fighters and teach them peace. They ain't gonna hear any of that talk. First of all, they must be approached from a military perspective. And then that military perspective, that use of force perspective, you educate them from force towards peace. They first of all must realize that their gun, when they shoot someone, someone is gonna shoot at them. And then you disarm them and you put them in camps and detention centers where you train and teach them on peace. But you can't just walk in there shouting peace.
Dr. Ali, do you agree? So you have a reaction there to this militarization of UN peacekeepers?
Yeah, first of all, the UN is trying to address or to respond or intervene in new forms of conflict using very old tactics of peacekeeping. Okay. So they mean well, but the tactics and the approach is just wrong. My colleague has said that you cannot, you have a group in Syria, Iraq that has declared caliphate, and they've declared everybody infidels, and therefore they're going to kill whoever they find that do not subscribe to their ideology. And so the UN is not the organization or the body to send soldiers there. What should happen is that states should come together, either under the aegis of the regional organization, in this case perhaps the Arab League or the Gulf Cooperation Council, for the case of the Middle East, in Africa under ECOWAS or IGAD or the Africa Union, to be able to respond to regional challenges. Remember, most of these conflicts are regional actually, and the regional bodies understand the terrain, they understand the complexities, they understand the environment in which these conflicts are actually transformed. And when UN comes in, and in some cases invoke Chapter 7, then who else is going to come in and keep peace when the guns are silent?
And looking specifically at MONUSCO, we know now that this is the UN peacekeeping mission in the DRC. It's known as MONUSCO, but online on Twitter, you'll see that critics are calling it MONUSLess. Do you think that the UN peacekeeping mission, particularly in Africa, might be losing some credibility?
Actually, the case of the Congo is a little unique, because very many of us in Africa really feel that actually the Congo didn't need a peacekeeping. And many of us actually think that the Congo is trapped in a resource conflict more than any other kind of conflict that we've seen elsewhere. There are regions like Rwanda where we know there was ethnic conflict. Other regions like Liberia and Sierra Leone in the past that have had ethnic conflict. But that one of the Congo is kind of a creation, something that has been created. That's why they feel the UN peacekeeping in the Congo is first of all needless there. It's useless, like they are saying. It's needless to be there. However, let's also say the truth. If there's a conflict, it doesn't matter where it is. And for what reason, the UN needs to be seen as that great brother, that bigger brother who comes in and enforces peace in a situation. But as my colleague alluded to earlier, I think the UN must adopted the tactic of working with the regional powers and see it's working in Somalia. I just came back from Mogadishu few days back, and the African Union in Mogadishu and other parts of Somalia have done a brilliant job. When you bring the regional forces, the countries that are within the conflict area, they understand the terrain. They understand most of the conflict leaders live actually across the borders of the conflict regions in the countries that are within. So it's easier for us here in Kenya to look for the guys who are leading conflict in Somalia and say, you will not come to Nairobi unless you resolve the conflict in Somalia. So the UN must adapt to the changing conflict nature and styles. If they don't and stick to the old Chapter 7, Chapter 6, then the UN is going to be needless, and I can assure you in another 10, 20 years we will actually phase out the UN and create something else for ourselves in the world.
Dr. Ali, I just want to pick up on this, the theory that you raised, that the best way for the UN to work is to partner with regional bodies or state actors. But we know, of course, that the UN peacekeeping mission's core values are consent, impartiality, and non-use of force unless absolutely necessary. What happens to impartiality then if the UN is working directly with states?
You see, when the UN is working working directly and trying to not keep peace but to enforce peace, UN then is forced to invoke Chapter 7 and is forced then to pursue and use overwhelming force to subdue the enemy, where it's supposedly present to keep peace. And so there is no peace to keep in theory and in practice, but there is open a war. And so it's easier. It's easier, it makes more sense when the regional bodies, whether it's ECOWAS, we saw what ECOWAS did in West Africa, in Liberia and Sierra Leone. It was very effective. And then UN came and kept the peace, and that worked. In DR Congo, UN is there directly. And we see that, people are not even now taking the United Nations seriously. But if the African Union was really empowered to an extent that is able to mobilize resources and send a mission into DR Congo to enforce peace, that would work. Then, when that peace is enforced, so when all these rebel groups have been subdued, then the UN can come and keep the peace. Peacekeeping is more dovish, and UN is very good at that. The problem here is that AU is unable to do that.
Just as far as closing comments are concerned from both of you, what do you think UN peacekeeping missions need to focus on, particularly in Africa, to be more effective and, of course, to spare the loss of lives in the coming future?
Yeah, first of all, well, these soldiers do a very good job in countries that they are sent to go and keep or enforce peace. Unfortunately, some of them misbehave, some of them engage in trafficking, some of them do engage in rape, some of them engage in sexual exploitation of children. We've seen that in the Central African Republic and in Congo. And it's very important that the United Nations is seen not to be covering these criminal acts that are committed by soldiers who are going to keep or enforce peace. And in fact, they taint the name of the countries that are sending them there and that of the United Nations. One thing, and my colleague has said, is training. Training is key. And it's very important that these soldiers are trained and sufficiently prepared to know that it's not just peacekeeping that they are going to do. Sometimes they are called to do and engage in peace enforcement, and that means actual fighting. And also they need to be trained on cultural issues. That you don't just send in a battalion that does not understand. If that battalion is going to interact with the population, it becomes very difficult for them, if they are not prepared in training, to interact culturally or in any other way with the populations that they are going to be serving.
Indeed. And any final words from you, Mr. Mbidra?
Well, I thank the UN leadership, from the Secretary General to the wing that handles peacekeeping, that they thought of examining this. We know the leader, the commander of the UN mission in Rwanda, a general from Canada, suffered almost irredeemable post-traumatic stress disorders, because as genocide was going on in Rwanda, there's nothing he could do. He had his hands completely tied by the UN peacekeeping terms of engagement. And this general, I hear, he's been in and out of hospital for the longest. But if the UN is doing this kind of a survey, it means they want to minimize cases of such generals happening in the future, and actually making sure that the missions are effective and sometimes even shorter, because these missions take longer if they cannot enforce peace sometimes. So when the bad boys and the conflict, they call them belligerent forces, when they know these soldiers coming can actually kill us, then they agree to talk. And sometimes that's all you need.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. It's very true. I think what you both pointed on there is that conflict is changing, and the UN peacekeeping missions need to change too. That is all we have time for this week, but thank you very much to my guests for their insights. Dr. Mustafa Ali, Security and Conflict Transformation Expert, and Mwenda Mbidra, Security Analyst and CEO of Eye on Eye Security. Now remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Lindy Mtongana, it's goodbye.